on this computer.
Well,
I need it. It's helpful. All right. We're on the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is the second book of the Bible as it's laid out in Judaism and in Christianity. Most everyone in here, I believe we were all part of at least for the most part, we were in the Bible study about Genesis, which was
right.
took us about 4 to 5 months or so. So this will be really fun to kind of put away our New Testament hat. We had fun with the Johannine community, and now we're back in the Old Testament. So I'll spend a little time, of course, orienting you here. But I tend to, even the times where I want to tell you all the stuff I've learned and know, and I think is cool, I have to kind of edit myself so that we can actually read the Bible. Novel idea for a Bible study. So I'll try to dole out all the wisdom, so to speak. I'm making fun of myself in the weeks ahead, video clips, things like that. But when you stop and take a look at a bird's eye view of the book of Exodus, there is so much gold in here, and gold being the operative word because this is the book with the golden calf, which kind of came up in the news this week, and we'll get to that when it comes along. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. It's the second book of the Torah. The Torah is the Jewish term, or the Hebrew term, I should say, for the first 5 books of the Bible, arguably the most important books of the Bible. However, in my book, study Bible, my NRSV study Bible, this editor says Exodus is arguably the most important book in the Hebrew Bible. In other words, the Old Testament. You would think that the creation story would be the most important, but a lot of people are standing up and raising the flag saying, I think Exodus might be the most important book in all of the Old Testament. So we're going to see what why they say that. Just so you know, the Greek word, if you want to impress your friends, for the first 5 books is the Pentateuch. Penta, think like pentagram, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the Pentateuch, the reason that word floats out there a lot is that at the time Jesus was born, the new thing on the scene, basically their version of the iPhone that caused a sensation, was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which the most important being the 5 books, the Pentateuch. So that was called the Septuagint, a variation on the word 70. But that's the book Jesus would have been familiar with. They would have heard Hebrew in worship, but they would have read and studied the Greek one. You were more kind of deemed to be, kind of society. Funny enough, I was just watching a video, a Netflix documentary on the history of video games, which is definitely more my generation. And I remember when the Nintendo system, so those of you with kids my age might remember this, but 1988, the Nintendo system came out with Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt. Remember all that? Remember
Yep.
Christmas in those years? Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That was what the arrival of the Greek Hebrew Bible translation would have been. That's what everybody wanted for, it wouldn't have been Christmas at the time. That's what everybody would have wanted for Hanukkah, I guess. Okay, I'm joking a little bit. One of the most exciting things about my injury is that it delayed us 3 weeks. I'm so grateful for your patience through all of that. But because of that delay, I was able to get an exclusive first copy of my beloved professor's new book called Holy Imagination. But it's not out on the streets yet. Somehow Andrew and I got an early copy. I have talked about Judy before, particularly when we talked about Genesis, and sometimes I talk about her in other Bible studies, but she was my Old Testament and Hebrew professor also for Andrew. So we are her disciples. Judy has taught at the Virginia Theological Seminary for 20 years, and her mentor was Ellen Davis from Duke Divinity School, who herself is a scholar of the Old Testament. Judy is African American. She is a Southern Baptist, and although she is ordained in that tradition as well. And of course, she's a woman, so she has a lot of unique perspectives, especially on the Old Testament. And she's one of the main reasons that made me fall in love with the Old Testament and Scripture in general. Her book, Holy Imagination, which is coming out this week, is a big deal because it's a companion to the whole Bible. Each chapter of her book follows a book of the Bible in sequential order and gives you a little bit of an outline, some major points and themes throughout. It really is a good companion. I don't know why I said I couldn't recommend it, because now that I describe it, I'm like, I absolutely recommend it. So there you go. I'm going to edit that out of the video in case Judy sees it. So I've already started reading this and getting excited about it. So I'm going to use her book as kind of my guide, because I always have at least one scholar I'm kind of following for my information that I'm sharing with you. So one of the things Judy points out about Exodus is that it is both an event and the book itself, right? So the book is called Exodus, but it also refers to a specific event, the Exodus, which is the parting of the Red Sea, which is the escape of Israel, the saving or salvation story of Israel as they move through the parting of the Red Sea. And she calls it God's signature act. And she also says this: unlike the creation story, which is in Genesis, which is universal in scope, Exodus is specific. In this story, God takes sides. And the reason that's so important, as Judy goes on to describe, is that the Exodus events and the book of Exodus is where Israel, and that goes down to contemporary state of Israel, but really the greater historic ancestral nation of Israel, this is where they derive their identity. This is where this is a signature moment for them that has captured the imagination of Israel for millennia, and helps them contextualize their experience in the world. The Exodus story, the book of Exodus, I think includes some of arguably the most greatest hits of any book of the Bible that you can think of when you think back to any maybe Sunday school class you had as a child or whatever, including baby Moses in the basket, which we'll read today. Pharaoh and the 10 plagues, if you saw the Charlton Heston movie. The 10 Commandments, speak of the devil, so to speak. The parting of the Red Sea, aka also what becomes known as the Passover. The worshiping of the golden calf. Manna from heaven. The burning bush, which we might get to today, probably next week. And last but not least, the talk of the promised land, which gets picked up by the prophets and even more modern prophets such as Martin Luther King Jr. Let me just stop there. Any questions or comments or observations so far? What's a great delight for Episcopalians in particular, although this is true for most Christianity, but especially for us, our Book of Common Prayer orients us around the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, but also orients us as a worshiping community around the great vigil of Easter as the prime worship event of the whole calendar year. In the framers of the Book of Common Prayer, modern Book of Common Prayer, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, in their perfect world scenario, everyone attended the great vigil of Easter and then maybe went to Easter brunch or something the next day. Easter, the Great Vigil of Easter this year occurs on April 3rd. It remains to be seen how we're going to do an in-person version of it, but we probably will do something. But we will definitely have a pre-recorded, edited video one too for those that aren't comfortable coming in person. And in that great epic service, we move from an epic service squeezed into 1 hour, thanks to me. But anyway, we move from darkness to light. We move from the emptiness and darkness of the tomb, where we left Jesus on Good Friday, to the sudden, both awe-inspiring and exhilarating discovery by Mary Magdalene that the tomb is empty and that Jesus has risen. And as we move from darkness to light, physically in the church, we turn on the lights. We begin in darkness and candlelight, and then we turn on the lights, we turn on the organ. Usually we have brass, maybe not necessarily at Grace New Lenox, and we sing Jesus Christ is risen today, and we say the A word, not the expletive, but the word that we can't say in Advent, yada, yada, yada. But before that, we build the drama and the suspension in that service by a huge focus on the reading of scripture, where the readings in the Book of Common Prayer set aside for the Easter Vigil tell the salvation story from creation to the prophets that illustrate that God's work in the resurrection of Jesus Christ has been a track that was laid since Genesis and through Exodus and on and on. That this is what God does with humanity. He always, or she always, rescues us, saves us, and tries and uncovers new and innovative ways in order to make that salvation possible. What's so cool about our Easter Vigil service is the priest usually has some leeway in what they can do. There's 9 readings assigned. Usually a church averages about 4 or 5 readings at the Easter Vigil. It's a lot to ask to sit through 9. Maybe at a cathedral, you'll get the 9 readings, or a really high Anglo-Catholic church. But look on the left side, it's a little tiny, so I'll read it to you. This is in the rubrics of the Book of Common Prayer, which again, is usually where the theology is often found sometimes. In other words, our belief system comes out in how we are directed to pray. And it says here, at least 2 of the following lessons are read, of which one is always the lesson from Exodus. After each lesson, the psalm or canticle, blah, 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 blah. So it's basically saying to me, Greg, as the programmer of the service each year, you can do all 9 services, you can do as few as 2 services, but no matter what you do, you must tell the story of the Red Sea parting, the Exodus. That is critical to understanding, and you see the connection. Why is that connection? Well, we're going to uncover it more and more as we read Exodus, but you have to understand this idea of the Paschal mystery, which in a word is Jesus becoming the new Passover, the Christian Passover. As God led Israel through dry land, parting of the Red Sea, into safety, so God is doing that to all of humanity when he leads Jesus out of the tomb resurrected again. Pause and time out. Any questions or observations or anything?
I have a comment. It's just,
Yes.
I have newly received the Women's Bible, and I was
Yes.
looking in the introduction, and just a nifty comment that they expanded on a little bit is that women appear a lot in the book of Exodus with important roles.
I love that. Yes, and that happens in chapter 1 or
Yeah.
chapter 2. Yes, with two really important forgotten characters of the Bible. So thank you, Mary. I can't wait to find out what more that particular book has to offer to us as well. You're right. It's not just the story of Moses, although Moses is clearly the main character here. But there is a lot more to it than meets the eye. All right. The authorship and dating, briefly, like Genesis, like the rest of the Torah, the 5 books, we don't really know exactly who authored these. Historically, you do need to know that the church and Judaism has always attributed the authorship or the writing to Moses. Now, you've heard me say before, it's incredibly unlikely that Moses in his advanced years would have said, let me sit down and put all these things to tablet. I think it happened far, far later, well after Moses was dead and buried, that a community would come together and write this together with different sources contributing to it in different centuries, in fact. What we do know is that it finally came together in its final form sometime around the 6th century BC, which we now call BCE, before the Common Era, before the birth of Christ, so around the 500s. And this is critical. It happened during Israel's exile in Babylon, the Babylonian exile. So 2 cataclysmic things in the history of Israel before Jesus comes on the scene. For Christians, that's the most important, right? For Judaism, the 2 most important things are Exodus and exile. Think of them as 2 poles, North and South Pole. The most incredible thing to ever happen to them. God literally saved them in a supernatural event. And then exile. God has seemingly abandoned them into bondage again. And for Israel's sake, and again, the book will lay this out for us, it seems as if Israel feels as if they did something to deserve this originally, and they exile, that they are being punished for some reason. Because of those two things, Exodus and exile, that will be wrapped up into Israel's identity. And I'm talking about the nation Israel, not necessarily the modern state of Israel that's from the 1940s. However, obviously, that's part of it as well. Okay. Pause there. Any questions or need any clarification? All right. So again, if you're writing from a place of exile, much like St. Paul wrote while in prison a lot of times, that's going to color a lot of how you tell the story, isn't it? So that's going to be interesting. I will refer to that over and over and over again, I'm sure. And then, of course, we love to look at the structure of the book before we get into it, and maybe refer to it from time to time. It's actually really simple. It seems like a long book. It's over 40 chapters, but it's really two parts. Part one is the Exodus, all about the Exodus, leading up to it, and then the aftermath. So Exodus 1:1 to 15:21 is a story of God's power of redemption and God's power over Egypt and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. This is, again, Judy Fentress Williams' structure. Part two is in purple. Look at that, 15:22 to 40:38, a far longer chunk of the book. It's not a split down the middle. And that part is all about the wilderness. You sometimes hear this referred to euphemistically. Sometimes it's referred to about St. John the Baptist being out in the wilderness. That's all important. God's provision in the wilderness. Can anyone take a stab at what provision means in this context? Anyone want to take a stab? David, might you be able to tell us? Oh, he's muted, sorry. There we go.
God's provision, just his caring for them, food, clothes, watching out for them in an area of desert exile.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Providence, God's providence is a term that's still used today, where we theologically, when we talk about why good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, that kind of thing. How it both means God's providing, and then also why is God not providing as well. So God's provision, but in this case, God's provision for them in wilderness is God's protection and care for Israel while they are in the wilderness wandering. It's about covenant with Israel, part two. So establishing a covenant, which we've seen before in Genesis a few times. You think about those generations, starting with Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, Joseph. God keeps coming back and covenanting again and again. It involves the instructions at Mount Sinai. So that ends up being the 10 commandments on the 2 tablets. And then, of course, community and worship in the wilderness. So in other words, kind of a blueprint for how the community is to behave as a society while they're in the wilderness, how they worship God, what are kind of their guidelines for each other? What are their covenant with each other? How do they treat each other? Okay, and with that, I think we are ready to start talking about the Bible. The image here is what we're going to begin with, which is, how does the story begin? It begins with a baby, and that baby is Moses. So we're going to start with Exodus 1:1, and I'm going to read the first part from the New Revised Standard Version. And before I go very far into it, I'm going to stop and pause after the first sentence and talk to you about the name of the book for a second. Verse 1:1, New Revised Standard Version. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Okay. The Episcopal priest read from the Bible, and then he stopped and went back to his PowerPoint. I'm just teasing myself a little bit here. On screen before, oh, you know what? I had a whole slide in here and I can't find it. Oh, nope, never mind. Never mind. I had a whole slide and I deleted it by mistake. We'll come back. Here's what I was going to tell you. Do you remember when we talked about Genesis, that in Hebrew, the books have different words, different titles. So the English title Exodus, the English title Genesis, those are different, entirely different, not just translation, but different word entirely from what the Judaism refers to these books as. Does anybody remember how the Hebrew scriptures came up with their titles for each of the books?
They come up with them generally from the first word of
Yes.
yeah.
Exactly.
That's why it's Shemat here for Exodus. Yeah.
That's right. The first major word, I should say. So if a book starts with the word the, you wouldn't call the book the. But how does Genesis begin? In the beginning. So beginning in Genesis, Bereshit is how the Hebrews called Genesis. In Exodus, it has nothing to do with the word Exodus, which for us is a derivation of the Greek word, which means exit or parting. The first phrase is, these are the names. Well, you wouldn't call a book these, so instead they call it names. So, or the names, which is Shemot. Exactly, David, Shemot, the names. So, and what are the names? Well, it goes to remind you, this is a little bit of a recap from Genesis. So they're giving you a little summary here of, remember when we left off with Joseph? All was well that ends well. And his family was promised to fulfill Abraham's promise of the generations to populate the earth. And that's exactly what happened. It reminds you of all the tribes, which are the historic 12 tribes of Israel. But the descendants of Joseph and his brothers and all that whole generation have now moved on off this mortal coil, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Okay, and now we're back. Verse 8. Now the new story. Here we go. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born of the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. Okay, I saw at least one smile during all of that. Can anyone kind of give some thought or some reaction as I elevate my foot? What do you notice, or what sticks out to you here?
I mean, I really admire the midwives for,
Yes.
I mean, they must have been incredibly fearful of the Pharaoh, but to disobey him, I mean, that was probably unthinkable.
Exactly. Mary, you were right in giving us a heads up that women were incredibly important in here, and it starts right here in the very beginning, in an act of defiance. And what does God do with that act? It feels like in Genesis, lying was a no-no, but what happens here? They lied, and God thanks them for it. So remember in Genesis, we had the repeating motif of the tricksters.
Yeah.
Often it
Yes.
was women or the sons of women, like Jacob, tricking his
Mhm.
father Isaac to giving him the blessing, the birthright. Remember that?
Yeah.
God, this is a complicated issue because later in this book, it'll be put in stone, do not bear false witness. But what do you do with this inconsistency? I don't know. I can't keep from cracking up because I keep thinking of all the people that quote the Bible out of context to suit their own needs. Because every time somebody says, there's no occasion where you should lie or blah, 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 you go, well, it seems here that God is pretty okay with it. And I'm making fun of it a little bit and poking fun, I should say. God is rewarding them because the lying here was done to save lives.
Mhm.
There is a role for tricksters in God's kingdom, especially if there's an ends to justify the means, which is, if that doesn't sit well with you, that's okay, because the Bible will give you something in a later book or later within this book to counteract that, because this is a cacophony of voices. Any thoughts or reactions, anybody?
Greg,
just
this summer when, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
this summer, we read this, and then I think
Yeah.
that,
And my husband
and it was
preached.
so, yes, and it was like, so good, and it just brought it back home, so now I'm really understanding it.
Yeah, you see what
now.
the difference a good teacher makes. When it came up in the lectionary, he said, Judy would be so proud of me if I preached on Shipra and Pua, because she spent time talking about it just as we're talking about it now. Yeah,
Right.
Right,
you have good memory.
yeah.
What were you going to say, Leslie?
I was just saying, I thought it was really interesting how when Pharaoh was making them do all this extra work and thinking they would, be tired, but the more they were oppressed, the more and more people that there were more of them. And so it was kind of backfired on his own, his ideas and his thought processes. He thought, oh, if we do all this extra work, then they're not going to have time. They're not going to take time to have extra babies. And of course, the more they worked, of course, the more God just constantly kept increasing their fold.
Yes.
And so I thought that was really interesting. And and then I did like the idea of Pua and Shipra, that how strong they were, that they really were willing to stand up to Pharaoh and realize that they were midwives. Their job is to bring life to this earth, not to kill them. And they couldn't go against their own beliefs and their own thought processes. So they just, I don't understand that part of it, the lying part, but you had to do it.
Exactly.
Because later on we're told not to bear false witness. But I think there are times when you need to, I don't want to say lie, but kind of extend the truth a little bit,
Right.
so that the right information is out there and everything. So I just thought that was interesting, but I just really thought that Pharaoh's ideas backfired when he tried to make them work more and more and more hours, and it didn't stop them from having increasing their fold. The Hebrews were just constantly increasing.
Yeah. Oh, well said. I mean, first of all, there is kind of a wink wink that there's a status, there's kind of an implication of the not the virility, what's the word I want to say? the opposite of sterility. The, just
Fertility.
yes, that's it. Yeah. Of Israel, that you can try whatever you want, but we're going to keep making babies. And by the way, the Pharaoh's concern is military. He's not necessarily, it's not Hitler here exterminating them because of misguided hate and or whatever, or just because of pure evil. He's saying these Israelites are going to keep procreating, and then they're going to join our enemies, all these other tribes, and then they're going to take over. Whether or not that was the case, who knows? But that decision out of fear becomes a decision that will haunt Pharaoh and his progeny for the rest of their lives, and really the history of Egypt here. But you're right. It's the midwives make a gut decision, a visceral decision to say this is wrong. This is, to me, the blueprint of social justice from in the tradition of faith, where you go, this is just wrong on a moral, ethical level, and I have to stop. I have to call power to task in many ways. Now they don't quite get to the point where they're telling Pharaoh to his face, you're wrong, and they're taking a punishment for it. There's the trickster finds a way to keep living, right? That's good. That's great. You need that. When Moses later comes of age, you all know the story of Moses to some extent, but you know that he's going to confront Pharaoh with a little bit more of the backing of the power of God behind him to say, let my people go. But the seeds of social justice here, of speaking truth to power, begins here, and it begins with two women, and it's really incredible. It's really incredible.
These women are so important that their names are remembered and Pharaoh's name is not.
Right.
It's-
Right. Yes.
Mm.
Shipra and Pua. That's absolutely right. Any contemporary or somewhat contemporary stories stick out to you at this point, or any parallels maybe in
Well,
literature or anything?
I was thinking about at the beginning about the enslavement of, that was pretty graphic description of what they had to do. And immediately I thought about Black people at the beginning,
Right.
of our story, what happened with them. It wasn't because they were multiplying too fast, but that same prejudice was there.
Exactly. Yes. Good point, Mary. Anybody else? Okay, maybe I think the next phase of the story will conjure up some connection for you too. So chapter 2, would anyone like to read maybe the first part of chapter 2? I'd say 1 to 10 from their Bible. Go ahead, Ann.
I have the Women's Bible. the
Oh,
Women's
great.
Study Bible.
All right.
Moses rescued to rescuer.
Okay.
Birth and adoption. Now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds, sent her slave girl, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child, and there he was, a little boy, crying. She felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, I drew him out of the water.
Yes, the Hebrew word Moshe means draw from water. Moshe, that's how you'd say it in Hebrew. Okay, what did you notice here? Or what caught your eye, or raised any questions too?
I was wondering, they never gave Moses' mother a name? Or
No, they
does-
didn't. Isn't that interesting? I think because the kind of the legend of Moses, and the historicity of this remains to be seen about how these details actually happen, but they are strangely specific to the point that I actually tend to believe some of these details historically, and because things that tend to happen within the last 2,000 years before before 0 AD or CE tend to be based in some kind of history. So, I mean, at least in scripture. Maybe it's possibly no one knew her name. I don't know. It's a good question.
The whole thing about Moses is interesting because Moses has some precedent in Egypt, in the names of Egypt, like Tutmosis and other, which means has to do with a follower of or a representative of Tut and the whole thing. So that gives some historical validity to the concept of Moses from that. On the other hand, they give it a Hebrew connotation here, where it was drawn out from the water. Now, if the Pharaoh's daughter spoke Hebrew and understood that, it's kind of surprising that she would use that name, Moshe, to introduce him to the Pharaoh as that would give him an idea that this might be a Hebrew baby. So the concept of Moses' name has some roots, or some ramifications that go in several different directions.
Right. Yeah. Oh, it's so fascinating. Yeah. What else? We've got a lot has happened already. A lot of just very iconic moments have happened, I should say. Yeah.
And that basket that they refer to as the papyrus basket, that's also the word they use for ark in the terms of, and so there are some like backstory or implications of the ark and being saved out of water, like Noah and his family were saved from water, and Moses also was saved out of water, out of one of those.
Yes.
So.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I didn't know that about ark. That's amazing.
Yeah.
There's another little word fun here that Judy Fentress Williams had pointed out for us as well. Oh, by the way, this is a little portrait of Shipra and Puah. Probably more accurate to their ethnicity, actually. Unlike this, Renaissance painting here, which is fine and all, but part of I mean, these were all people of color, and still are Egyptians as well as Israelite, as people in the Holy Land or Israel, Palestine. However, what I like about this painting is it's the decidedly white-looking Egypt here. These are the princesses of Egypt, and another story or another version of the story would be interesting to see how they would try to explain a very kind of Jewish-looking, Middle Eastern, I should say, looking Moses baby being accepted in a more whitish kind of family here. But actually, in reality, they wouldn't have known by looking at him that he wasn't Egyptian. So anyway, but on the word study front of things, there's this interesting line here in English. My copy said, "The woman conceived," and this is verse 2. "The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months." A fine baby, and I think later somewhere it'll say healthy and beautiful. Well, that phrase, fine baby, what a great, you don't say that normally when you run into a child like that, but nevertheless, that's what she said. Why does she say, what a fine baby? Because that word, he is fine, or that what is fine is in Hebrew, what is that? I can't remember. Katov, that's it. Tov, like Mazel Tov. You've heard that phrase, Mazel Tov? That's actually Mazel Tov would be the more proper pronunciation. Kol Tov is the same words that were used in Genesis 1 when God said, saw what he had created and said it was good. It was Ketov. So that the woman saying here, what a fine baby. The mother of Moses giving birth going, what a fine baby. When in reality, she would say, where's the epidural? Probably more, probably fine baby is not quite the first thing that mom would say, or.
Well, I had a thought.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I guess also this little story, what I also take out of it was also the strength and the courage of these two women.
Right.
I mean, the sister of the Pharaoh and the daughter of the Pharaoh, again, they must have been so terrified of his wrath,
Right.
or, and always trying to please him. But here, both of them go out on a limb, the baby touches their human, instincts.
Yep.
Now it just starts to make me think about just all the other Egyptian women as compared to the men. I wonder I don't know, it just makes me wonder how they got the courage to defy their father
Right.
and brother.
And you're reminding me too, it's incredible that up to this point in scripture, and really for the duration of scripture, we're not going to encounter many evil women in the entire span of the Bible. I can think of a few off the top of my hand that are truly, nefarious. But at most, we've seen women just be a little scrupulous. But usually it's to get, in Rachel's case in Genesis, she was trying to stick up for herself. That's, if a man did it, no one would think twice about it. But here, these women, are doing what is necessary for a greater good, a more moral obligation good, right? And it's even implied that the women of Egypt, who are royalty, are in some kind of act of defiance from the patrons, the patriarchs in many ways. It's a great point. It's just curious. It's really curious, particularly when oodles of the Bible are used to enforce a patriarchy. If I would venture to say, God, 9.5 out of 10 times it's the men who are evil or wicked in the Bible. So
it seems that there's a bias in the Bible throughout for the underclass, and one of those, of course, is women. And then there are, in some cases it's the Hebrew people, in some cases it's the poor and the widow, but there seems to be a bias that the story is told from that perspective.
Absolutely. And that is going to be underscored when Moses comes of age and speaks to God in very soon. And we'll read it next week. And God will try many times to lift up Moses and even encourage him. And Moses will say, I'm not worthy, to some extent. And that happens so much too. But God is like, no, that's exactly why I want you. That's exactly why I want you, because you feel unworthy. Now that what we've read, anything pop culture or modern literature or anything stick out to you as being particularly resonant or evocative of this first two chapters of Exodus? I mean, I've got something. Just like you're waiting with bated breath, right? I can't let a Superman metaphor go by without talking to you. But do not forget that the writers of Superman in 1938 were Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who were two teenage Jewish boys in New York and Brooklyn, who were writing a story where it's all about the supermen, the Übermensch from Friedrich Nietzsche, turned a society of supermen send their little child in a proverbial papyrus basket to a new civilization where he'll be raised kind of in disguise, right? Later, of course, these Jewish boys who probably been picked on their whole life as teenager and everything, it was important to them to make their hero kind of a mixture of Hercules, even wearing kind of the circus tights of like a strong man, who has all the abilities that they wish they had. Because again, it's part of even modern Jewish identity to feel this kind of continuing conflict between, ingenuity, the trickster mentality, right? Of Shipra and Pua, even though that's not their heritage, but that's part of it's kind of given to Moses by osmosis. All the stuff of Jacob, Rachel, that's all part of Jewish identity, and yet also that feeling of being put in exile, shame, guilt that they would feel, especially in the early 20th century. So to then manifest that into the character of Superman, who would endure and become a Judeo-Christian figure, is really fascinating. But it all begins for them and their storytelling with a kind of a retelling of Moses being put in the basket. It's really amazing. Anyway.
I
Hmm.
really think that I'm always amazed when you come up with your
Well, I
analogy.
didn't come up with that. They did. Yeah.
No, but I mean, I feel like you,
I just led you to it. Yeah.
have you always been like this? Have you always like found Bible stories or God like in things growing up, or that just started happening when you entered the ministry?
No, yeah. Not when I was young, but somewhere in maybe my college age, I had started to pick up on the Christian parts of something like Superman or Star Wars. And then
Wow.
later documentaries and things. I toyed with showing you some pieces of a Superman documentary, but I didn't want to just lose track a little bit. But it's out there for the finding that either DC Comics or producers of the movies or writers said, no, it was intentional. This is why they wrote this. And it's there, it's in the DNA of the character. And other iterations of the characters, particularly the movie, which holds my heart, the original movie, they dialed it up. They said, there's way more. The Schuster Siegel team did it at a very nuanced level, but in the 78 movie they dialed it up even more, particularly the Christian part of it. Yeah. And so then you go, how could I not have seen this?
Yeah, I've never noticed anything that relates to anything. So that's when we had that one adult education, and you're like, for next week, you should tell like where you find God. And I was like Googling the internet. I'm like, I gotta come up with something.
Yeah, where to find God.
And I'm like, I got nothing. But
Well, stick
I
with
really
me.
admire that about you.
Well, thank you. I now that I've done it for several years, I just enjoy doing it. Look, but I just learn it from other people. I mean, even the same professor Judy taught an elective class at seminary, which is called I think, what is it, Monsters and Demons in the Movies or something like that. And using scripture as kind of her guide. So
Okay.
this is out there. This is trained. This is now academic in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah,
Rick, I have a
Joseph,
Okay,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead, David.
Go ahead, David. Yeah.
Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Myth of the Hero, and it has to do with most classic stories, even if you talk about Star Wars or so many other examples, basically of the person who is born, doesn't know his identity, gradually understands his identity, becomes the Messiah, the Savior, of his people. So this is a motif that is ancient, and it still continues in a lot of popular movies and culture today.
Not unlike how even the birth narrative of Jesus, and again, this is okay. Please don't let your whole faith shatter right now when I tell you this, but even the birth narrative of Jesus borrows heavily from an existing kind of mythos about great characters and great leaders, like even Julius Caesar, because that was a contemporary of Julius Caesar's rumored to have been born in strange circumstances as well, and other people as well, other ancient figures as well. David's absolutely right. These tropes are as old as civilization. In fact, I just bought a book. It's like 700 pages. So I'm not really going to read it. I'm going to kind of reference it, but it's called The 7 Stories That We Tell. I think you may have heard this before, but there's basically this argument that there's only 7 stories in humanity. I'm talking about fiction stories, the stories we tell in movies, literature, everything. they're based on one of 7 patterns, and that's it. You know, like for example, one is rags to riches, that somebody is, you know, born in poverty and then becomes unexpectedly wealthy. And the other one is the hero's journey, where somebody, like David says, like Moses, like Luke Skywalker, like anybody else, comes out of obscurity to slay the beast. David and Goliath, same thing. It's all of a piece of just how humans tell stories. It's really amazing. I think this is actually a good place to stop, if that's okay. And we'll pick up next week as Moses matures into young adulthood, and starts to pick up the mantle that I think was passed from Shipra and Pua. I find the connection really clear there, even though they never knew Moses. Oh, it's so much fun, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you all so much. It's good to be back. And
Glad to see you.
yes, this was wonderful. We'll see you same bat time, same bat channel, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Take care, and I'll see you over for noonday prayer in a few moments too. Good to see you.
Okay.
Bye,
Bye,
Jen.
Bye, everyone. God bless.
Bye.